Welcome. I'm Hedy Cray, and I have with me Laura Hillman. This is our first webinar coming to a great number of people across lots of different states and even territories. Good afternoon for those on the East Coast and good morning for those on the West Coast. We have an incredible amount of diversity and interest to address today. And what I'm going to start with is a welcome and acknowledgement on account of our traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we currently are on, and we pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and future. I'm also going to flag that we have a Q&A mechanism set up in the right-hand corner, and I encourage you, given the diversity of both the attendees that we have, but also the subject matter that we're talking about, that you put those questions through. We have a moderation team that will send the questions to Laura and I, and at the end of the session today, we are going to attempt to address as many of those as time will permit. To start, I want to actually have a poll. So before we commence into the main topics for today, a poll will open to help us understand a little bit about each other and what our current experiences are. So the poll is live. Please activate and tell us your experiences. Are you in the office? Are you doing a combination of working flexibly? And that will help us, Laura and I, and everybody on the session today, to think a bit more about some of the issues that we're going to address. To start, it has been a period of incredible disruption, uncertainty. The words you know, unprecedented, has generated from confusion. Do we wear masks? Don't we wear masks? Health directions, changes to health directions, border changes, hotspots, uncertainty, media, inconsistency, financial inconsistency and uncertainty, and the concern for business viability. So much has happened. So much is continuing to happen. It is not possible to deal with all of the things that we have to deal with today. We could actually be spending days unpacking and talking about some of the risks and issues that employers and employees are facing moving forward. Today's focus is going to be the snapshot of employees who, at least for many since the entering into stage 3 in Queensland, have had the ability to return to work if they were not already essential workers and working and continuing to work during this period. A big shout out to the healthcare workers, to those in warehouses, supply chains, the essential workers, and those who actually stocked and assisted our grocery stores that worked through this period. We are focusing today on those who have worked from home and how we can get those employees back to work and what the new norm is going to look like. So, as we finish the poll and we start on the topics for today, today is that working from home piece and looking at how it worked, what are the risks, what actually happened, and did it work well, and where didn't it work well? Fundamentally, the question that I get asked a lot, can I require my employees to come back to work? Is it true what I'm reading, that I have lost control and I will never be able to get them back to work? What does this mean? Connected critically to that is what is a safe return to the workplace and understanding what our legal obligations will do and require us to do so. Whilst I apologise for all of the words which I'm sure you have overheard, getting back to normal, the new normal, and whatever that may be, we are going to look at the employment and industrial relations issues that have been forgotten along the way and some of the risks that have developed through the process of the last 3 to 4 months of managing things which now have become a broader space in our workplace: family and domestic violence, incident reporting, risk assessments, and underpayment claims. We'll look at what the new workplace flexibility requests will look like in light of the trial run that the pandemic has given us. And ultimately, as you don't know if I'm wearing a complete suit or if I'm actually doing a newsreader outfit, We will look at redefining office wear and figuring out whether the comfortable tracky pants can actually make it into a new office environment. So the poll is live. I think we need to bring the poll to an end.
And what it seems to be showing is, in terms of where people are predominantly working from, we have 40% working from home remotely currently, only 20% predominantly at the workplace, and the other 40% have a regular and consistent combination of home and office.
That is consistent, I think, with a great number of the questions and comments that we're going to be dealing with today in relation to those topics. So today is about leadership in resetting in a workplace. Leaders are also clearly employees. The things which we all need to realise and acknowledge is that the leaders are suffering the same as employees. That means that we too all have fear, uncertainty, the impact of all of those items regarding family, community, and the responsibilities that come to us as employees that we need to address. However, what we are attempting to address today is a resetting to realise that there is and can be nothing more than reasonable management action for employers to address returning people to work. There is no one-size-fits-all, I'm sorry guys. We actually will need to ultimately look at individual workplaces, industries, and individual employees when discussing some of the problems that we're going to highlight today. But fundamentally, reasonable management action is going to be about complying with the public health directives and our workplace health and safety responsibilities to reset and regroup where some things may have fallen away due to the emergent nature of how we found ourselves working from home and subject to stay-home orders. So where are we at right now? For those in Queensland, and obviously considering the diversity of those on this webinar today, we are going to see continuing changes. Announced yesterday, I'm sorry, Canberra, I was going to come and visit you next week. Unfortunately, now the borders will close on Saturday morning, and Queensland will not allow me to come back in without 14 days of mandatory quarantine. It is a dynamic and changing space. Doing this presentation has been quite difficult because it changed and continued to change for everyone leading up to, as I said yesterday. Fundamentally, our stage 3 roadmap, the requirements in relation to where we actually are required to and allowed to have employees returning to the workplace and the terms upon which they return are the key requirements that come from our public health directives. Fundamentally, it's also the requirements that have created a lot of confusion and a lot of social media and media coverage regarding border inconsistency. I too have had the questions about how come Danny Minogue managed to get into Australia under special terms and conditions. If you haven't already looked at the public health directions in each of your states and territories, they do have discretionary exemptions. And Danny Minogue did also respond on social media as to the reasons why she was given a special exemption, and that related to her health and medical condition, which was obviously accepted for the purposes of alternative quarantine arrangements. But it is the inconsistency, including the allowance of 100 people in your home, but then the restrictions of social distancing and the 4 square metre rule that do create a lot of concerns and questions from employers and employees alike. Fundamentally, the journey that we have to map as we move forward is to look at, in March, we had a range of restrictions and issues that flowed from the public health directions which required us to stay home. That resulted in, as we know, significant impact with border changes, border restrictions, quarantine, and also the stay-home orders, which were, unless you were an essential worker, you had to actually work from home if you could. But if you could not, then employers were faced with stand down and consideration of alternative arrangements to support employees. We had urgent applications to the Commission, state and federal. We had variations to awards, enterprise agreement variations, and a significant response in relation to our regulatory environment and safety support. There are excellent materials that are available for all employers, if you haven't tapped into them, in your regulatory environment, both at the Commission level and in workplace health and safety. There are also excellent guides that are available from Clayton Utz that has mapped all the briefing note requirements of the issues that occurred during this period. What it did require, though, was an urgent assessment, and an urgent assessment of how business could respond. Could the employee work from home? Was it possible to do so? And if you could not work from home, what were the requirements regarding stand down? Then, of course, Easter came with the uncertainty that JobKeeper created on eligibility and the directions and the further amendment to the Fair Work Act for JobKeeper-related directions. The questions continue to occur in relation to the application of a lot of those matters, and we're going to talk about a bit of that on the way through. It was an emergent situation. Clearly, we were all faced with planning on the run, where suddenly we had our workforce, which could work from home, actually now working from home without some of the normal assessments and ergonomic impact of what might occur. Now, we will talk today a lot about what is a workplace. The reason for that is it is the underpinning requirement in relation to both safety, workers' compensation law, but also duties and responsibilities between employer and employee. The fact that we have a workplace that is now a home workplace means that there is a blending of those responsibilities. In an ideal world, as we all would have known and had before, most businesses have policies and procedures and expectations regarding assessment for a home office where employees may wish to work from home. A whole range of reasons occur for that. Number one, ergonomics would be a better word to say, although probably economics might become relevant a little later. So ergonomics, the setup, is the table and the chair appropriate, or will we have workers' compensation, RSI, back pains, and many of us, myself included, still have shoulder pain in relation to this period? Because the answer is a lot of those assessments didn't occur. Was the office, and is there an office for confidentiality of documents and separation, and for the requirement to comply with the directions about how you conduct yourself at work? It is trite to say that the law and the expectation in the working from home space has been set and fairly consistent for a long time. However, in March, people worked from home very quickly, and they got IT set up, and there was a run on monitors and computer equipment unlike any else that we had seen. Video conferencing facilities, and we are now experts, all of us, in a great number of them, have skyrocketed, and accessibility and data plans have been the subject occupying most people during this period. Of course, it also had other consequences. We have learnt more about each other than probably we ever really wanted to know. Many of us have fronted up with the COVID hair and the lack of makeup, in my case, and I'm not saying anything about anyone else, but the reality is we all actually did the best that we could do. And many of us switched off the video when we couldn't actually cope with how we actually were presenting, or fundamentally our bandwidth and our internet capability actually let us down. The draining on those things has meant that productivity, efficiency, anxiety, and the holistic health and well-being of a lot of us have been affected while we have been attempting to meet all of the things that are juggled on the slide. The good thing is that through all of this, a sense of humour has prevailed, and the memes are probably some of the best stuff that has come out of COVID-19 in relation to lockdowns and periods of how senses of humour can actually help us get through. For leaders and managers, myself included, we have tried to bring brevity and a bit of fun into a workplace which was suddenly thrust only onto a computer screen. Unfortunately, myself included, sometimes it always isn't going to work and it can backfire, as identified on the slide for the poor supervisor who turned herself into a potato on the slides but wasn't able to turn herself back because the computer screen froze. I understand her pain. It is really hard to connect and maintain positivity and engagement with a team who needs to work constantly together only on a video screen, once a day, twice a week, depending upon the particular workplace. It can be a challenge and has been a challenge for many. So as we work through the working from home, there is a balance of some people have found, and some employees and businesses have found it incredibly positive. It's created a better work-life balance. There's no commute. We have fewer distractions. People can lock themselves away and get things done. There has been a tendency to have elastic waists on pants, no high heels, tracky dacks or sportswear as a comfort factor. And as a result, businesses too have benefited from a lack of expenses, less rent, less overheads, less travel. On the other side, however, there has been a tension on the supervision, the direction, the engagement and communication. There has been issues and red flags to manage, obviously, in health and well-being, and the issue of managing hours as work and family life blend. As some of the cues that would naturally happen at work, it's morning tea, it's lunchtime, it's take a break, it kind of all blends for some at home, and it is harder to actually differentiate. It's harder also to collaborate in the same way. The opportunity of dropping past an office, having an organic conversation about an issue or event or planning a strategy process doesn't happen as well if you're playing telephone tag and phones and mobile phones or communicator and all of the other different messages aren't being responded to and you can't see where a person is. And last but not least, and certainly I felt this personally, the isolation and missing your colleagues. I remember the first time we were back in the workplace and I looked at some of my team and went, I've missed this. That social interaction is really important for a lot of people. And as a result, the more that you become working from home focused as opposed to back in the workplace, it can change the nature and impact and culture of a workplace. During this period, as we, like many, worked from home in a variety of different ways juggling, our clients asked a lot of questions and had a lot of difficulties that they wanted to manage. These are just some of the frequently asked questions and issues that our clients wanted to understand more about. The difficulties of managing autonomous and non-autonomous employees. How can you supervise people who you don't actually ordinarily supervise in the sense of a day-to-day activity, but their activities otherwise really require them to be at work? Junior staff who may never have actually worked in an office and have just started or commenced in a new employer, starting to experience and work with people that they didn't know, didn't trust, in the sense of understand how to work with, as opposed to necessarily understand what they were doing. Autonomous employees and those who were self-directed, obviously different supervision requirements, but supervisors' questions about communication and updates and productivity also arose. Productivity was generally the major key during this period. While most of our clients were clearly understanding of the enormous band-aid we were putting around everything and saying, we all are in this together, let's work through what we can and find the next path, business productivity and timelines still needed to be met. Court deadlines for some, for example, also clearly needed to be met. While court wasn't appearing in person, Microsoft Teams and other facilities were promoted and used by most tribunals, courts and commissions during the process, during the period. Turnaround of work, timeliness of work, typographical errors in work, frequently caused distress for many managers as they communicated trying to actually lift performance and engagement and productivity during the period. Keeping in touch and how to actually balance the care for employees. I made the joke about the slides and the brevity of what humour may actually produce, but actually reaching out and engaging with employees who you might have red flag concerns about also became so much harder. And suddenly people became a lot more conscious around how they were doing so as you were zooming into somebody's home at the same time as you were addressing issues regarding their health and their capability to continue to work. Last but not least, and probably one of the most difficult issues for supervisors managing employees who are working from home, is communication and hours of work. And we found that it's skewed in different ways. It could be the employee who worked around the clock. Now, for some employees, working flexibly was fantastic. But if they're not communicating to their employer why or where they are, and the flexibility of going for a run at 10 o'clock in the morning, or going shopping, buying the groceries, or picking up the children or dropping the children off at different times of the day that weren't normally part of a usual work day, communication distress and the impact of management of those employees also created concern. But we will talk further and try to manage and unpack some of the issues around working from home when it goes the other way, which is the aspect also of seeing the emails at 3 o'clock in the morning and knowing that employees shouldn't be doing that and what employers were doing to try and intervene in it. So we have to take a collective deep breath and say it was hard. And for some of us, it still is hard because, as our poll identified, there are still a great number working from home and supervising others who are working from home. And we need to acknowledge that we all did the best that we could, but it is time to reset. And it is never too late to reset on the expectations. So when we are looking at returning to the workplace versus working from home, fundamentally, we have to start with the government directives and workplace health and safety responsibilities. We are fortunate in Queensland currently that we are able to work and come to work. There is no restriction on us for having employees not come to the workplace. Now, the issue of managing an employee's return to the workplace is the COVID safe risk assessments and plans, depending upon the nature of business and industry in which you're in. But remembering what I said before, there is no one size fits all. Some employers are happy to continue to allow their employees to work from home. Some of them are encouraging it to occur. What we need to be focusing on is what is best for the business and the operational requirements of the business for productivity, culture, education, supervision, learning, and we need to learn from what we've experienced in this pandemic. Fundamentally, I would say to all of those who work with me that realistically, if you are frustrated by some of the experiences, do not let them fester. Now is the time to reset and collect our thoughts around how we want to manage these matters moving forward. So the public health directives, they are identified on the slide. We had stage 1 from May, 2, and then stage 3 in red is where we are currently at. Stage 3, as I outlined, reflects the return to work and the ability to return to work in a variety of different ways with the 4 metre squared rule, social distancing still required in the workplace. I'm not going to go through all of the different directives and requirements because, amongst other things, they are very well supported online and we have interstate participants on the webinar today. The reality is in each state and territory, they have very similar obligations. While there might be differences, there are fundamental obligations regarding health directives on businesses, activities and undertakings, but also, apologise for the typo, it's a border, not a broader, restriction directions in relation to entry into your state and territory. Fundamentally, each of these, if you don't have a restriction beyond social distancing, will still require workplace health and safety obligations to be met. In Queensland, the key requirements are supported by the guide, the Workplace Health and Safety Guide for COVID-19, the ability to prepare your COVID-safe plan, and whether or not you are a restricted business in accordance with the requirements set out. If you are a restricted business, there are mandatory additional requirements which will have you meeting additional responsibility for planning and COVID risk assessment. Even for those who are not restricted businesses, there are always responsibilities for meeting workplace health and safety obligations. So, to work from home or to return to work, that is the operational requirement question. Some businesses, as I said, have realised they don't need the office space. They don't want the expense. Some businesses are planning to remove and basically forego their rental areas and move to a hot desking arrangement to reduce their cost, to become more efficient, and to ultimately provide more flexibility for employees. There are a couple of big announcements made in recent time, as you can see from the slide, mostly from the tech companies in relation to employee flexibility being committed, in Google's case to June next year, in Twitter's case for forever, and for Facebook, dependent upon where you live, and if you were going to move outside of the area of San Francisco, the reality of also working from home. However, working from home forever is not possible for all businesses, and nor is it a requirement or entitlement for an employee to maintain that they may work from home. It comes back to what the operational requirements are and what the job requirements are. For others, as I said, working from home has not produced the plethora of extraordinary benefits and advancements that others may have achieved. For some businesses, it's been about teams and visibility, supervision, education, and culture. For some businesses, it's also about client service and client interaction and production. Some of these aspects cannot be performed exclusively from home, and as a result, there has been a different focus from others attempting to maintain those lawful and reasonable requirements. Note also the commentators regarding the impact of working from home. Ben Wober says, if too many employees regularly spend more than 2 days a week away from the office, it is going to damage the long-term dynamic nature of the enterprise. It will impact on who you can collaborate with, because collaboration of its very core will be restricted to a time engagement exercise. It ultimately will also affect how we train people and the experience of the younger generation coming into the workplace as to how their communication, collaboration, training and advancement will occur. There is a lot, as I know you will have already experienced, being said about the issue of returning to work. This poll particularly resonated with me, and also with the experience of Clayton Oots, as we were naturally all ourselves returning to 100%, at least in the Brisbane office, back to work. The quote is, underlined by me, that does not feature in the poll. Now that some of the employees may be able to return to work, it appears that about a quarter emotionally are ready to do so. Another quarter are reluctant because of concerns about COVID safety, while half have a personal preference to work remotely. Balancing each of those three items is a matter that all employers will need to look at moving forward, and Laura is going to be addressing some of the flexible work practices which come with preference as opposed to anxiety, and the impact of whether they're emotionally ready, and the concerns regarding safety, some of which I will be dealing with. Can an employer require an employee to return to work? The answer is yes. You can require an employee to return to work. How you do so, the basis upon which you do so, and the communication you use will be very important in relation to meeting the operational requirements, but also the impact of a lawful and reasonable direction, care, safety, and consideration of other factors dependent upon why an employee may not want to return to work, including discrimination and adverse action. Fundamentally, it has been well settled, probably now for upwards of 2 decades, that if a job requires interaction at work and has been formed on the basis of being in a workplace, that it is an inherent and essential requirement for a person to attend at work. Flexibilities are not about what the job requires, they are about accommodations that an employer reasonably and appropriately might provide. It does not mean that if a business is needing productivity and performance outcomes that are not working in the way that the business requires, that you have to continue to allow a person to work from home. What it does mean is that employers need to be very clear on that resetting about expectations. And as one who also has seen the impact with so many clients of the distress and anxiety that has been created during this period, we need to do so with compassion and understanding, but also business clarity and honesty. A lot of us have all been very concerned to look after each other, and I'm not saying we should be brutal by any stretch. I'm saying that we should be honest about what the business needs and what isn't happening, so that the employer frustrations that occasionally I hear about can be actually addressed through clear expectation and paper trail. Like everything in employment law, communication is the key. So if you're going to lessen employee anxiety, you're going to need to make sure that you are absolutely tapped into your policies, procedures, your workplace health and safety commitments, your COVID plan, and you've got your communication absolutely under control. What is the communication issues that amazingly keep coming back to bite? Cleaning. I have never spent so much time looking at cleaning contracts and expectations about cleaning as I have during this recent period. Staggered start and stop times, the impact of how many people come into a lift, the competing medical information. Can you contract COVID 1.5 metres social distancing, 15 minutes in an otherwise confined space, noticing how could anyone spend 15 minutes in a lift? There's some very public statements outside of Queensland regarding the impact or lack of the ability to contract COVID unless you had somebody sneeze in your face in a lift. However, all of these things add to anxiety and need proper planning and communication. Bathrooms, ridiculously underdone in terms of communication and expectation. Most office bathrooms actually aren't going to meet the ability of the 4-metre rule. Communicating, as each of the premiers in the states have, about common sense and expectation and good signage all links into the aspects around ensuring we are reasonably managing that safe return to work. However, be aware of social distancing risks. Suddenly, when you have people back in the workplace, that natural engagement and happiness that comes from seeing each other can sometimes bubble up. Monitoring the amount of time that people spend in offices with the door shut, with that 15 minutes and the 4-metre rule squared needs to be maintained. It's awful to sound like a party pooper, but the reality of life is if we actually want to return to work and continue to socially distance, we have to be aware of the impact of how we congregate in workspaces into the future. That also is a matter that impacts upon productivity, and it's about watching out for those patterns. If an employee has a concern, of course, it's really important to listen to them. Supporting employees at this time, particularly with all of the difficulties and fear and anxiety that I've talked about before, is important not only to help them understand the steps for lawful and reasonable return to work and a protection of their safety and the safety of their co-workers, but also discussing ways in which you can support them generally to step up and meet those productivity and business requirements. We will be doing a session on the 26th of August, which is for the resilience impact and the COVID impact for the preparation for Are You OK Day. There are many things that COVID-19 is showing us in relation to resilience and care for workers at work and ourselves. For the purposes of talking about returning to work, if an employee has a concern, even if it wasn't a pandemic, we would still be sitting down and talking to them about meeting the business requirements and supporting them about what their concerns are to the extent that you can reasonably do so. Again, be honest about the expectation of the role. Reset those expectations. A lot of habits have occurred. It may have been drinking more than one glass of red wine a night. I will be guilty of that for certain months of the last couple. But the reality is reset those expectations. It's never too late. Be clear and support with trials and flexibility if you're uncertain about productivity versus managing those concerns. Again, watch the patterns of behaviour. Realising that if we don't communicate well on these matters and we are unable to meet and balance those safety concerns, that industrial disputes, industrial action, withdrawal of labour as occurred in relation to the slide with Spotless in the last week is possible, as is regulators coming into our workplace to ensure that we are meeting and auditing us against the meeting of those safe work requirements. So as we move forward, the reality of looking at these issues also will require us to realise that we have blended that workplace. The home workplace now has become more part of what and how we have performed work than ever before. I mentioned the office ergonomics and setup. It's not too late if you weren't able to meet during that period the expectations of assessments to communicate, document and reset on directions. It is not too late to remind people about incident reporting. Fundamentally, the nature of not reporting incidents that may have occurred, again, at a home workplace, is the impact of how you can manage and address your obligations moving forward. The hours of work red flag. For many employees who enjoyed the flexibility of potentially taking the kids to daycare in the middle of the morning or going for a jog or cooking or doing something else that they would not normally do whilst they were at work has meant that a number have worked outside of their normal hours. For employees who are on annualised hours, for award or enterprise agreement employees, managers need to watch and reset hours and expectations if employees are working from home, and to expect disclosure and communication around what an employee is doing, because fundamentally flexibility is great, but if that flexibility means it's not documented, consented and otherwise within the scope of the individual enterprise and industrial arrangements, then we may create risks for underpayment and risks for additional fatigue and other management issues that need to occur. Resetting and not letting those emails at 3 a.m. go unchecked remains very important. Duty of care. One of the hardest things I think that has come out of the working from home and return that we have had, at least for the last 2 months, has been bringing people back to work and productivity with the one size fits all. If you are unwell, don't come to work. Now, as a result, remove the pandemic from your mind. If you had an employee who was unwell and who came whatever they were unwell for, you would send them home. Your duty of care as a manager is to not allow an employee to work when they are unwell. The blending of events that have occurred this year has meant people are not taking sick leave and people are not taking annual leave, and they are working from home, sometimes potentially not as productively as they would otherwise be because they may be unwell. We need to stop the working from home if people are unwell, and we need to maintain and address the fact that if an employee is otherwise sick, they should be not working. If an employee wants to work from home because they are that unwell but don't want to come into a workplace, or because they may have a COVID symptom, which we do not want them to come into the workplace for, then we need to address and paper trail the impact of disclosure and management. because reasonable management action at its core for workers' compensation and duty of care is employees should not be working when they are unwell. It is a balance, and again, it is one that I would say watch the patterns. If there are concerns about productivity and people are working from home saying that they are not well, please intervene early, because managers should not be allowing employees to continue to work even at home in their pyjamas if they are unwell. Last but not least, at least for me at this stage, is the legacy matter to watch of the workplace. As we have just heard, workers' compensation and the consequence of making a workplace that is now at home deal with the fact of incidents and claims can all follow through in the same way as if it happened in the workplace. However, we have learnt more about our employees and the family and domestic violence overlay, privacy and disclosures that have been necessary to occur to support employees in our workplace potentially than we ever have before. Resetting also on the confidentiality and commitment of managing those matters moving forward is also important in the support for employees and the proper return for managing those matters as people return to work. And now I'm delighted to hand you over to Laura.
Thanks, Hedy. So you mentioned resetting expectations and revisiting processes is something that this pandemic has provided some great opportunities for. One of the topics that has been much discussed and creates a lot of giggles is workwear and presentation. In particular, as more people are working from home and we are doing more work and engagement via video conference, navigating requirements, potential risks, but also considerations regarding employee engagement and transition back to the workplace can be a challenge. Full disclosure, that picture is actually my cat. He does not need to grapple with any of these challenges because he doesn't have a job. As we're all well aware, different industries have different requirements when it comes to dress. Dress and presentation standards have also evolved over the years. But what I want to focus on today is where expectations and requirements can blur in our current world, namely where employees are working from home and engaging with others, in particular clients and co-workers via video conference. As more employees continue to return to the workplace, depending on where they are, it can also be an opportunity for employers to revisit and reset expectations regarding employee presentation. No doubt we've all had a giggle or be stunned at those Zoom fails, such as where employees have appeared topless at work meetings. But I think we can all agree that issues like that are a little more clear-cut, as if you are required to wear clothes at the workplace, clothing is never optional when it comes to a work video conference at home, whether it's a client meeting or a casual team catch-up. However, there is also the issue of balancing comfort and professionalism, with reports of employees appearing on screen looking as they would on the weekend or at the gym, looking like they just got out of bed, and may have lost sight that while they are working from home, it is a workplace and the meeting they are participating in is still a work event. And you'll be pleased to know it's not just Australia. Justice Dennis Bailey in Florida felt compelled to write to the legal profession in his state and remind lawyers to treat video conferences, court hearings as hearings. There we go. Sorry about that. Looking like they've just been wearing bathing suits, are sitting in bed, attending hearings, or being ill-groomed. More subtle dress and grooming matters can be more of a minefield though, and commenting to employees about appearance and dress, if not handled carefully, can give rise to issues such as potential breaches of anti-discrimination law or may potentially be bullying. It's also important to keep in mind that where employees are juggling a lot, especially where they are required to work from home, where there are other competing obligations such as carers' responsibilities, focusing on appearance can impact confidence and morale. A decline in dress and grooming that is out of the ordinary for an employee may also suggest other issues, such as they may not be coping well and potentially have mental health issues. This does not mean that as employers, we cannot address with employees concerns regarding appearance and presentation and set expectations, or that we should be speculating about mental health matters. However, when setting expectations and addressing concerns, it's important that communication and expectations are reasonable, connected to the business needs and the role, are clear and applied consistently and fairly, and focus on presentation and professionalism as opposed to physical appearance. So as dress standards have evolved this day and age, have we now reached a point of allowing track pants in the office? Just for a bit of fun, we have a poll opening, which I may use as evidence in my debate with my brother on this issue. Are you team yes, track pants are wicked awesome and we should wear them all the time, or team no, just no, no, no?
How do we know I'm not wearing track pants right now?
I can verify for the record that Hedy Cray is not wearing track pants under the table. Well, I don't know whether to be happy or sad at that result. We have, so far, it looks like the split is about 88%, 89% of no. The no's have been very prompt to respond.
Would it be different if it was active wear? No.
So very, very interesting to see people's attitudes. All right. So while there are announcements from various companies, as Hedy has mentioned, that they're going to continue to allow or require employees to work from home on a long-term basis, we also anticipate that there will be more working from home requests from employees or employees who don't want to come back and want to continue working from home, which some of you may have already started to see. There does not need to be a pandemic to approve employees working from home. Working from home requests can be facilitated in a range of ways, including if you've got existing policies. There's also legislation, such as flexibility requests under the Fair Work Act or equivalent state legislation, requests for ad hoc working from home arrangements, or just reaching agreement with your employee regarding working from home for an agreed period of time. Also, under anti-discrimination law, employers can be required to make reasonable adjustments to the workplace to enable an employee with a disability to perform the inherent requirements of their position. Depending on the situation and disability, working from home may be seen as a reasonable adjustment. However an agreement is reached, it's crucial that employers comply with their obligations at law, including regarding workplace health and safety and employee entitlements. Similarly, it is a two-way street and employees also have obligations that they need to comply with, including with respect to safety, conduct and performance. Also, it's important to remember that subject to any public health directives, there is no right for an employee to work from home. However, there is a right to ask, including under the Fair Work Act, and employers are required to consider requests. If a request is made under the Fair Work Act, there are requirements regarding response and timeframes, which has been set out on the screen. And also, while we're focusing on working from home requests, obviously flexibility requests can be for other things as well. While it is an express requirement under the Fair Work Act, regardless of whether a request is made under those provisions or not, it is always recommended that a paper trail is kept to ensure clarity and to manage the risk of claims, including ensuring employee requests are put in writing. If the request is agreed to, what has actually been agreed to is captured, and if the request is rejected or alternative options have been proposed, written reasons are provided. Also, I just wanted to flag that if rejecting a request while keeping a paper trail is always a good strategy to support employees to understand the reasons for rejection and manage future risks, if a request is made under the Fair Work Act, it's also important that the reasons you are relying on and want to continue to rely upon for rejection are captured in the written response. Not setting out the reasons you are relying on may prevent you from relying on those reasons if the rejection is challenged before a commission, which is what occurred in the Victorian Police case mentioned on the slide. Case law also makes it very clear that employees are not entitled to demand certain work arrangements. An example of this is the decision in the Fair Work Commission in Phillips and Integrated Medical Solutions. In the Phillips decision, the employee was a medical receptionist who in October 2018 took unpaid leave due to her mother's death, which resulted in the employee taking on carer's responsibilities for her young sister. In March 2019, the employee contacted her employer to advise that she was ready to return to work, but made a request for changed arrangements, such as her working hours to be from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m, to have 1 week off each school holidays, and to have 3 weeks off at the end of year school holidays. The employer refused the request and provided written reasons for refusal, including explaining that the practice has a greater requirement for reception staff at opening and closing times. The practice employs a large number of working parents, and it wouldn't be fair to reject their request because one employee has an entitlement to leave every school holidays The practice would incur significant additional costs because they may need to bring on casual staff, and it can be practically difficult to employ casual staff during school holidays because that's the time casual staff are often not looking for work. The employer very benevolently offered alternatives, including that the employee could work from 8:30 a.m. to 2 p.m. or can convert to casual employment, and made it very clear that at all times she could return to full-time employment. The employer asked the employee to confirm her return to work arrangements and then advised that if it didn't receive any confirmation from her, it would treat her employment as having ended. The employee did not respond, so the employer advised that her employment had ended. The employee made an unfair dismissal claim. It was unsuccessful. In addition to finding that the employee had not been dismissed, the Commission found that the employer repeatedly, reasonably and professionally corresponded with the employee about the reduced hours of work it could accommodate on her return, and the employee could have returned to work but chose not to accept the reasonable alternative arrangements that were proposed. Similarly, it was found that she was not constructively dismissed. Importantly, for the matters that we are talking about today, the Commission also noted that the employer was not bound to agree to an employee's flexible working arrangement request, and an employee was not entitled to demand certain working arrangements. So as a result, there are a range of things to be considered when considering a request to work from home or ongoing working from home arrangements. Importantly, not every role can be performed from home or remotely. Being able to work from home is not just about having the right computer setup and software. For a role to be suitable for working from home, the role needs to be able to be performed at the standards required by the business to meet productivity and performance requirements. Also, that an employee is working from home doesn't mean they can never be asked to come into the workplace, including, for example, for meetings. So when considering requests, additional things to consider include what is the request being made under, and are there any requirements that need to be addressed, such as under the Fair Work Act? Can appropriate supervision and support be provided? Supervising employees remotely can be difficult and more time consuming as there are fewer organic opportunities to observe and be able to provide feedback and support. If the employee themselves supervises staff, can they provide appropriate supervision and support? And are there going to be additional costs of implementing or continuing a working from home arrangement? Should there be limits put in place, such as review timeframes, to check in and see if the arrangement is working for both the employer and the employee? How will workplace duty of care obligations be met by the employer and the employee, such as what Hedy mentioned, undertaking an ergonomic assessment? How will processes be managed? For example, if an employee is subject to a discipline process or a complaint, working from home might actually provide a mutually beneficial solution because it supports the employee comply with the directions that they may be subject to in terms of communication and contact. On the other hand, if the employee is subject to a performance management process, a working from home might impact a supervisor's ability to be able to monitor their performance and provide support. How will work hours be monitored and recorded to ensure that the employee is performing the number of hours they are required to work, but also to identify if they're working too many hours, such as sending emails at 3 a.m, as Hedy referred to. Ultimately, whatever is decided or supported, it is important that as employers we are always engaging in reasonable management action and carrying out those decisions. An example demonstrating how all of these considerations can be interconnected, but also addresses one of the questions that has popped up in this session, is that during the pandemic and as businesses are moving to return employees to the workplace, there are employees who are concerned that they are in an at-risk category, including because they have compromised immune systems due to pre-existing medical conditions. As I'm sure we're all aware, what is a disability or impairment under state and federal legislation is very broadly defined. As mentioned earlier, reasonable adjustments are to be provided if they enable an employee with a disability to perform the inherent requirements of their role. However, an adjustment that does not achieve that is not reasonable. So let's say an employee made a request on that basis. Some things to consider before responding to the request are, first and foremost, can the role be performed from home? Are there factors that weigh against that, such as the employee might be new to their role or have additional support and supervision requirements? If the employee is relying on a medical reason, but you don't have enough information to understand it, you can request more information. And what is the actual risk to the employee, including, are you in a COVID-19 hotspot, or are you in an area that's never had a case at all? If the request cannot be accommodated and there are other steps that can be implemented to address the issue and support the employee, these should be explored. For example, if the concern is a risk about contracting illness, exploring with the employee why they think they are at risk, outlining and reinforcing the steps that have been taken to reduce risk, and if necessary, provide more social distancing for the employee, such as it could be as simple as moving their desk further away. Also, if an employee takes public transport, if it can be accommodated, can hours, start and finish times be adjusted to help manage peak times on public transport? Over to you.
Thank you, Laura. The resetting is to go back to, as Laura outlined, treating requests to work from home as flexible working requests to allow proper consideration on each individual matter as opposed to a one-size-fits-all. Certainly, it has been suggested by a number of commentators that the pandemic will mean that it is harder for employers to meet a refusal to a working from home request. For the reasons that Laura just outlined, that will not be the case if employers are able to articulate what are the requirements of the job and, as I said earlier, being clear about the expectations of what hasn't been working on the productivity and commitment. Moving forward, however, the things that we need to get back to in the new normal piece is a range of things that have been there the whole time, that businesses have not been focused on, understandably, due to a whole range of other aspects, but continue to apply to all employers. And as a result, on the slide, there's a number of things that I'd encourage people, if they haven't thought about it, to go back and continue to look further in relation to their contracts, annualised salaries. Those commitments came in March. The impact of annualised salaries and the wage theft legislation and bills in various states and territories, and the auditing against awards, enterprise agreements, certified agreements, and underpayment claims is a hot topic and continues to be a hot topic for many employers who have not been paying correctly. Superannuation remediation and the ATO threshold timeframes and amnesty in relation to failures of many nationally to pay appropriate superannuation for leave loading following the tax ruling, which was missed by many, needs to also be considered and addressed in many businesses. JobKeeper. Whilst many were confused by JobKeeper, it is coming to an end, and new thresholds and responsibilities will be introduced for those for the extension, which will then be available until March next year. Many businesses who have been using JobKeeper have raised concerns about, are they able to continue on JobKeeper when they really don't have the ability to maintain employees? Decisions about restructuring and redundancy are being deferred, but those decisions aren't going to be able to be deferred inevitably. Fundamentally, looking at and identifying those aspects will be important moving forward, as will be the family and domestic violence interface, which Laura will speak about now.
Thanks, Hedy. As we've discussed, a person conducting a business or undertaking must ensure, so far as reasonably practical, the health and safety of workers at the workplace. Working from home can blur those lines between what is the workplace and what is home. And home can become the workplace, and therefore an employer's duty of care will extend to it. This provides risks not only for workplace health and safety, but also for workers' compensation. The home can have a range of risks which need to be explored if considering a working from home request, including if working from home is going to be longer term or a more permanent arrangement. And managing these risks, it's important to delineate what is the home and what is the workplace, such as making it clear what in the home is actually the workplace, such as the office, kitchen and bathroom, as opposed to the whole house and yard. Assess that the work area is appropriate. Is it ergonomically appropriate in terms of work surface, chair, lighting, temperature, and other identified slip and trip hazards such as pets, cables, that type of thing. Reinforce work conditions such as what are the hours of work and requirements. Consider how will work stress and well-being be managed, such as through support and supervision, and consider other domestic or family violence risks or other such risks. A survey of 15,000 Australian women in May 2020 by the Australian Institute of Criminology revealed more than half of women who had experienced physical or sexual violence before the COVID-19 crisis said that the violence had become more frequent or severe since the start of the pandemic. Domestic violence can come in many forms, not just violence from a partner, but can also include abuse from parents, and for older workers, it can include abuse from their adult children. As we already know from the studies that have been done in this area, domestic and family violence impacts employees, and that can impact the workplace in terms of performance. However, if employees are working from home, such abuse can also have a more direct impact, including to create a hostile work environment and potentially become work-related. An example of this is the sad matter of workers' compensation nominal insurer and Hill. In this case, the worker who had worked from home was killed by her partner, who also was her co-worker. Her partner, who had paranoid delusions, became convinced that she was spying on him and conspiring with government agencies about him. One morning, her partner killed her with a hammer. He was later found not guilty of her murder by reason of insanity. The employee's dependent children made a dependency claim under workers' compensation law in New South Wales. The insurer denied the claim, and the claim was subsequently accepted by the Workers' Compensation Commission. The insurer appealed the decision, arguing that due to the cause of death being because of the partner's delusions, which were not real, they could not form part of her employment, and therefore there was no connection between employment and death. The appeal was dismissed, with the court finding that the physical attack materialised as a result of a hostile work environment created by the employee's partner, who was incidentally her co-worker. The employee died at a time when she was available to attend work calls and other matters in the course of her employment. In particular, the evidence reflected that she often worked outside of normal business hours, taking calls, and would make herself available. And that was a key thing that was considered in deciding that this did actually occur while she was in the course of employment. Not all injuries at home are necessarily connected to work, and whether an injury is work-related will turn on the facts of each case. For example, in Demazy and Comcare, being injured while going for a run at a random time during the day was found not to be in the course of employment. However, in Hargraves and Telstra, being injured while coughing and walking down the stairs, ironically to get cough medicine and to lock the door, was found to be connected to employment. As a result, it's important to properly consider the risks of working from home and properly delineate and structure what working from home is when agreeing to a request. And a question that's popped up is how does an employer handle the need to spot check and inspect workplaces and employees' home? Obviously, to enter someone's home, you're going to need their consent. However, incorporating that into the agreement for working from home is something that can be done in terms of if an employer has concerns that there might be some unsafeness at home, they can do a check. I've seen many policies where people say an approval won't be given unless an assessment is done first and the employer sends someone out to do that. However, if an employee is refusing to provide such access, obviously depending on the reasons, it can be a matter for a lawful and reasonable direction and a basis to say this isn't working and we need you back in the office. As Hedy mentioned, we'll be discussing mental health matters, resilience and strategies in much more detail during our webinar session on the 26th of August as we move into Are You OK Day. But for now, as it is connected to today's topic, I'd like to provide a small snapshot as whether employees are working from home or at the workplace, mental health remains important and in particular during these challenging times. In particular, people's mental health can be impacted by a range of things, many that are not work-related at all, as outlined on the slide. Sometimes stress and anxiety can be difficult to identify in employees, especially those working from home, as there are fewer opportunities to observe the employee directly, as you do when they're in the office. Also, sometimes it can be overlooked, and productivity boosts can be credited to working from home when studies have shown that often productivity boosts during times of uncertainty and upheaval are actually due to anxiety. Studies that are being done also identify that successive work video conferences can also create fatigue and impact upon how people develop their relationships. As employers, many of these events and stressors are outside of our control. However, as we all look to support each other and navigate the complex challenges that we face, it is important that in engaging with each other and discharging our duty of care, we all keep these considerations in mind, including to check in with our employees. This includes, as part of supporting employees readapt to the office environment, checking in with them, regardless of whether they're at the workplace or at home, ensuring that all employees are included in matters, including where they're working remotely, such as making a video conference option available, and monitoring and managing workload. If your business has an employee assistance program, periodic reminders of the availability can also help. But even if your business doesn't have EAP, there are many community resources out there, and you can remind your employees of the availability of these. Some examples include SANE, Lifeline, Beyond Blue, and for domestic and family violence, 1-800-RESPECT. Whatever state or industry you're in, we are all facing challenges arising from this pandemic, and we are all doing our best and learning along the way. As we navigate each stage of this pandemic, and 2020 really flies by, it's important that we as employers take opportunities to pause, reflect, and where necessary, reset our approaches to working, whether it's returning employees to the workplace, supporting ongoing working from home, and revisiting approaches to processes and activities so we can continue to engage in good practices to support operational needs, meet our legal requirements, and support employee wellbeing.
Now, we appreciate we are on borrowed time. However, there's 92 people still online, so we're happy if you're happy to continue to look at some questions. Laura flagged some of the questions in relation to matters as she was delivering some of her last messages. Number one, let's just revisit on the how do you handle a spot check in an employee's home. Laura's absolutely right. You can make it a condition. However, in the current world we live in, and particularly an increased use in video conferencing, there is a whole range of other ways that you can address directions and assessments in those places of delineated office and appropriate ergonomic and chair. Now, you can't do an ergonomic assessment without, well, you can do a limited but not a complete ergonomic assessment without physically being there. It is going to be a matter of managing how much more resetting needs to occur that may not have occurred to date. When we moved into the working from home through stay-at-home directives, we focused everybody on giving directions to employees about how you expect them to work from home. Those directions still have an appropriate place, which means directing them about how they conduct themselves at home and the delineation of their workspace is an important part of that holistic management of the homework office. However, using other tools such as video conference will assist before you can actually then address the issues of an on-site ergonomic assessment. A couple of the additional questions that have come in include the impact of, as Laura touched on, the vulnerable employees. And the vulnerable employee assessment is one that will need a greater emphasis of understanding what their concerns are, particularly as for many in the state of Queensland, there has been no community transition or impact, particularly North Queensland, for close to 4+ months. The reality of everybody being aware of their social distancing, personal protective equipment and other required directions that apply in a workplace, sitting down with an employee who may be reticent to return to work on the basis of vulnerability and supporting them with understanding the safe and appropriate directions that apply to them is the path to help them get back to work and to ensure that you are lawfully and reasonably requiring them to do so. Some of the other questions that have come in relate to JobKeeper and the extension, and do you actually have to keep employees? You don't have to keep employees. You can make employees redundant. In fact, some of the heartbreaking questions that occurred for many employers were the impact of having to maintain employees through stand down and JobKeeper on the ongoing cost to the business that businesses ultimately couldn't afford. Whilst JobKeeper is a significant subsidy to business, the continued accrual of leave while employees were stood down is a matter that affected a number of businesses and deferred redundancies. Unfortunately, that deferral of redundancy is not and was not possible for a range of businesses. JobKeeper and redundancy are not, in fact, connected. JobKeeper and the requirements of JobKeeper reflect a subsidy. If an employer is unable to maintain the employment of an employee, or if an employee's normal interaction with employment gives rise to performance or misconduct termination, they cease to be eligible for JobKeeper. They will, however, be eligible for other wage and income support through other government initiatives. The extension we'll have to JobKeeper has different thresholds and different auditability requirements that will need to be maintained. It does not mean that employers are unable to make people redundant if the circumstances of their economic and financial situation otherwise means they have the need to consider to make forced redundancies. All right. Will slides be available? Yes, slides will be available.
Yes. Including with all the memes.
Yes. As I said, the memes are quite wonderful to be able to actually explore and remember some of the happiness in relation to those. Another question that has come up: can an employee demand compensation for the costs of working from home? And can an employer offset the claim against savings, e.g. no requirement for uniforms and travel costs? Now, it's an interesting question, and of course one which during the period dependent upon how an employer actually required and regulated an employee to work from home and directed or authorised them to incur additional expenditure. A lot of things happened on both employer and employee side. Certainly, many employers had increased cost with IT equipment and other facilities to help employees work from home, and employees, many of them may have incurred additional costs for internet provision, bandwidth and accessibility to be able to work from home. For an expense cost, there are different consequences for tax expenses for businesses and employees. In terms of offsetting expenses versus tax provision, in the situation of that question, I would encourage the employer and employee to sit down and talk about the aspect of what that cost is. Employers should be clear about what they will pay for and what the consequences of doing so are, and employees should understand before incurring expenses whether those expenses are incurred with the consent and provision by the employer, or whether there are other personal expenditure, including in relation to bandwidth, that they are using the information and accessibility for. Ultimately, there's no ability to offset and claim back from wages without offset provisions. What we're talking about, however, is expenses, and as a result, expense claim, policy, procedure and communication will need to be considered on a case-by-case basis. Okey-doke. The question that has just come in is, if you have a high-risk employee being instructed to stay at home, but they are basically unproductive, what are our options? From what we were talking about, if there is a situation with an employee who is considered high risk and subject to where ultimately that employee may be, for example, if employed in a hotspot or otherwise having to work in and around a hotspot, then naturally the broader safety directives and considerations will come into place. The issue around, depending on where they are, as I said before, and supporting their safe return to work, merely being a high-risk employee does not mean that they cannot safely return to work. It needs to be considered holistically. If, however, we accept that the person is not coming to work and the employer is concerned not to increase the employee's anxiety or address those safety issues, or because, as I said, they are in a hot spot and it's better for them to be requirement for them to otherwise be at home as directed, but they are unproductive. The aspects are, first of all, addressing productivity with them, as I said earlier, making sure that you sit down and say you are not meeting our requirements, and making it clear that if they can't meet the requirements, you will need to look at other alternatives. If an employee is unable to work from home meeting the productivity output requirements, as Laura said, in relation to flexibility, and we cannot return them to work, other considerations may need to be undertaken. Those considerations may be, depending upon the industrial instrument and the circumstances of the industry, stand down. It may very well also be other considerations of accessing leave and supporting the employee to access alternative leave arrangements, depending upon the circumstances of their inability to return to work.
And also on the comment mentioned about if someone has a very general medical certificate saying they should work at home because they are a COVID vulnerable person, I mean, wow, that is very broad, because a COVID vulnerable person could be so many different things. You do have a basis to be able to explore that and request further information, in particular, depending on where you're operating. Are you in a hotspot? What is the risk to, a normal, non-vulnerable person might be very, very low. And so, yes, that could be a basis to seek more. But it also, if someone does have a medical condition that is preventing them from coming into the workplace, potentially unpackaging it is still important, because if you don't know what it is it also a basis for it might impact their ability to work safely from home as well? And so I think receiving such a generic medical certificate should be something that should be discussed with an employee.
And to quote Laura from earlier, the pandemic doesn't remove normal employment obligations. An employee who gave you a vague or generalised medical certificate in relation to the performance of duties, period, in a workplace, would be the subject of further consideration and disclosure and consents between employer and employee to understand whether they are fit to do the job and whether or not they can be reasonably accommodated. Employers aren't required to accept generalised statements, and importantly, employers aren't required to otherwise just give the flexibility requested. Supporting employees about understanding the terms and conditions of employment remain the same, irrespective of the pandemic. And as we move forward to reset, it's important to get back to those practices of understanding that while we might be managing the fear and the media and some of the escalation and scare and concern that occurs for many employees listening to what is happening, that we are in control of our space and we are understanding our risk assessments and directions to provide a safe return to work are the key for employees returning productively or working from home productively, whatever meets the business needs. Everybody, thank you so much for participating this afternoon. We hope you have enjoyed it, and we hope that many of your working from home myths have been busted and that you're able to help make decisions to reset and refocus. And as always, remember your paper trail. Looking forward to seeing you in the Are You OK seminar, Are You OK Day seminar on the 26th of August. Take care until then.
Thank you.